Alrighty, so former President Donald Trump has weighed in on the prospect for World War III, and I have to say, I watched his little video on this, and I think he's 100% right. I agreed with every single word of it, which is a very good sign for his floundering presidential campaign, which has gone nowhere fast since he declared it way back in November of 2022. That was a long time ago, folks. And so in this video, Trump calls out by name Victoria Nuland, the American Viceroy of Ukraine, who has had the most hands-on influence over the goings-on in that country and America's policy towards it for over a decade now, I would say. She was instrumental in the Maidan coup way back in 2014. She was out on the Euromaidan handing out cupcakes or cookies. It's not entirely clear which. It's also not clear to me whether she baked them herself or not. But nevertheless, she was ecstatic at the prospect of regime change in Ukraine. In fact, she was even caught on tape talking about who she would put in place once what was his name? Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown. She was, bouncing around ideas, talking about who she would install next as the new leader, as that is her right to do. Her exclusive prerogative is to choose the leader of Ukraine. And so that's what I mean when I call her the American Viceroy of Ukraine. She is in charge of that section of the American empire. And so getting rid of her is like cutting off the head of the snake. That probably would deal with 50% of your problems. Now, the other 50% of your problems in Ukraine is everyone else in the national security industrial complex, as Trump dubbed it. These are all the generals, all the folks in the State Department, all the folks in the CIA, every last one of them. And as Trump went on, and I listened to his intonation, I realized that this was a fully scripted speech. He wasn't delivering it in front of an audience, he was just doing it to a camera. But this, the same thing, he was reading a teleprompter. And normally when Trump reads a teleprompter, without fail, almost every single speech that he gave throughout his political career that was off of a teleprompter, it was pretty mild, pretty toned down, and never as based as his unscripted remarks. This, on the other hand, is one of the best things he's ever said, and it was actually scripted. That tells me that he has decent people now around him, which is something that I was not very confident about up until this point, especially after the 2020 election and then the 2022 election. It just seemed, and Trump's various social media posts, it just seems like he has some strange echo chamber of weirdos around him. So at this point, I feel a little better about a potential second Trump administration than I did yesterday. So that's the political side of this. Now let's get to the reality side of this, which is, as Trump said, we are teetering on the brink of World War III. This is not a good thing. As we get closer and closer, I see less and less resistance from the Republican side. You've got, Thomas Massie, Matt Gaetz, a handful of others. Lauren Boebert, I guess. I think she's pretty good on the Ukraine stuff. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene, too, from what I understand. But again, in terms of the Republican caucus, these are fringe people. Rand Paul, too, in the Senate. Fringe people. Mitch McConnell, one of the most powerful men in Washington, the Senate Majority Leader, who was challenged at the very least by Rick Scott of Florida for the leadership position. He was able to hang on. So there is some dissent established now within the Republican ranks, even in the Senate. But I think that on an issue like this, Mitch is going to be able to strong-arm people enough to the point to where whatever aggression Biden wants to take with respect to Russia, I think that Mitch is going to secure enough Republican support in order to help the Democrats get it passed, even if it needs, let's say, a 2/3 majority. Washington at this point is primed for a third world war. I think that in this current environment, F-16s with American pilots, that's an easy get. Putin, on the other hand, has, I guess, taken off one of the last restraints that there was preventing war between the U.S. and Russia, and that was the end of the START Treaty, which was passed by Obama. No, I don't remember what the silly little acronym stands for. I remember that the T is for treaty, so it is kind of redundant to say START Treaty. It should have been like STAR Treaty, but it was like Strategic Talks on Arms Reduction, something like that. It was modeled after the SALT Treaty, which was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and Putin tore it up today. And, you know, I can get mad at Putin for doing that. Do I think that he should have? No. But frankly, this whole idea of pulling out of nuclear treaties was started by none other than Donald J. Trump when he was president. I can't remember which treaty it was exactly, but Trump decided to pull out of that, arms treaty with Russia for no reason, really. And so at this point, I'm not surprised that, Putin is jumped on that bandwagon as well, because why should he limit himself? He has no reason to believe, really, that the Americans are even following the START Treaty. America's official policy now with regards to Russia is no longer diplomacy and treating it like a normal country. The policy is regime change. Russia is considered a rogue state by American standards. And so the United States is going to make it its mission in life to end Vladimir Putin and anyone else involved in the present Russian government, and presumably they plan to replace it at some later date with a new Russian government that is controlled by the likes of Victoria Nuland, who will choose the leader of Russia, and perhaps they will even split up Russia and parse it out into different territories. Now, this is a fantasy. The United States does not have the power to affect regime change in Russia. The U.S. has not even been able to affect regime change in Iran, which is a much smaller and less powerful country. Despite their historic status, they were the Persian Empire, but in modern day, the Persian Empire is not what it used to be, and so they are certainly far inferior in terms of power to the United States. Nevertheless, they've been able to hang on since the late 70s. And so Russia, by comparison, the idea that you would overthrow their government by sheer force it's bonkers. It's cuckoo. The best the U.S. could hope for is to start a war with Russia that neither the United States nor Russia could win. We would destroy each other and probably the entire world in the process. But the Ukraine flag avies and the Western establishment believe that Putin is a coward and that nuclear weapons could never be used and that essentially it could never happen here. And usually when people have to resort to the argument it can never happen here, it almost certainly can and will ultimately happen here. We are just inches away from a direct war with Russia. The U.S. is completely 100% supporting the Ukrainian regime, as I stated yesterday. That is why Biden is going there to rally the troops as their leader. And Victoria Nuland today announced that the U.S. supports Ukraine directly launching strikes on Crimea, which Russia has considered to be a part of its sovereign territory since 2014. The people who live there are Russian citizens. And so, as far as the Russian government is concerned, the U.S. now is engaging in military strikes on Russian territory. We're perhaps a couple of months away from American pilots bombing Russia directly. Not Russian troops in a foreign country, bombing Russians inside of Russia. That's the next step from here. Because as I've said in the past, this whole talk, they've brought it up before and it's been shot down and it's been brought up again. They're going to get back to the F-16s eventually. And Ukrainians do not know how to fly an F-16. They know MiGs, they know Su-27s, Su-24s maybe the 27 they don't have. I can't remember. I'm not an aviation nerd. I know nothing really actually about planes. I just generally understand which, like I kind of have an idea in my head of what the U.S. and Russia had. If you tell me the decade, I can kind of guess what the standard fighter plane probably was, but I know nothing beyond that. But anyway, back to F-16s to Ukraine. They would need pilots, and so they might not be active duty U.S. Air Force pilots, but they're going to be American contract pilots. So basically the same as these mercenaries like the Mozart Group, which has gone bankrupt and is no longer in operation in Ukraine. But these are American veterans who are hired as independent contractors, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, which Russia does not acknowledge as mercenaries. Russia has made it clear they did this at the beginning of the war. I disagreed with it. But perhaps there was some wisdom in what Putin did by saying he is not going to... Actually, wait. What was it? I have to remind myself. They said they're not going to treat mercenaries as enemy combatants, I think. So they're not going to give them any rights under the Geneva Convention. Okay, so actually that wouldn't result in what I was thinking. What I was thinking was, since they don't acknowledge, the legitimacy of mercenaries in the country, the Russians could treat these foreigners as soldiers of their home country rather than soldiers of Ukraine. Because generally speaking, when you have mercenaries, like I was saying with the Hessians during the Revolutionary War, we didn't think of them as Germans. In American history, when you read about the Hessians, you understand, okay, they are soldiers of the British Empire. Sure, they don't speak English, and they're not from England, but they're working for the British. They're for all purposes, British soldiers. But I don't think that if you have American contract pilots flying American planes, dropping American bombs on Russian civilians inside of Russia, I don't think that Putin is going to say, well, that's not really America bombing us. That's not really an act of war by the Americans. No, I think Putin very, very much will consider that to be an act of war. And that means that the U.S. will be at war with Russia. Now, does that mean that he launches the nukes immediately? I'd rather not find out. I don't want to tempt him. But if I'm trying to be objective and not just, super afraid and cautious, I would say there's less than a 50% chance that Putin would launch the nukes over Americans bombing inside of Russian territory. In all likelihood, he will just retaliate against the Americans in a non-nuclear fashion. But nevertheless, the U.S. and Russia will be at war, explicitly, directly. And it will only be a matter of time before that escalates into a nuclear conflict. I heard Judge Napolitano say today that his theory is that the Biden folks want Joe to go into 2024 as a wartime president, because wartime presidents have a tendency to be reelected. In fact, I can't think of a president during a real war significant war ever losing re-election. We think back to Woodrow Wilson, he won re-election. Abraham Lincoln won re-election. I can't remember about the War of 1812. It was Madison was president, right? I can't remember. That might not have gone through. That might not have overlapped with the presidential election, so I'll forget that one. But let's start with the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln won re-election during the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson won re-election, I believe, during World War I, because he was elected 1912. We were in by 1917, and then Wilson was still president. Then, of course, there was FDR, Harry Truman. Was the Korean War started when Harry Truman won re-election? I think it was 48, right? Maybe not. Lyndon Johnson, though. He didn't win re-election, so there's an exception. Lyndon Johnson was he didn't run, but he would have lost had he ran. He wouldn't have even won his primary. Then after Johnson, the next wartime president would have been, you could argue Reagan because it was the Cold War, but you could say that about every Cold War president, including Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter, of course, lost. So I probably wouldn't argue that. But the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan during the second Bush administration, he, of course, won re-election. So perhaps the calculus on the Biden administration side is that, hey, our odds are better if we're in the middle of a war. Because, people, when you've got uncertainty, when you're in a wartime, people don't like instability. People want to play it safe. And Donald Trump certainly is not playing it safe. He's where you go to shake things up. And perhaps the calculus is people won't want to do that if we're in the middle of a war, especially with Russia. And so this can get ugly quick. I think that I am as worried or more worried than I ever was when Trump was president about a war actually starting. And when you consider who the war would be against, I'm much, much more concerned. I am far more anxious about this than anything when Trump was president, because the worst thing that could have happened is because of Trump's actions was we got into war with Iran. Trump was very, very aggressive and engaged in a lot of brinksmanship with respect to Iran. And a war with Iran would have been a disaster. The United States would have lost. But it is incalculable. The levels of bad, the levels of devastation in the United States because of a war with Russia compared to a war with Iran. And heck, we haven't even talked about China getting involved in the mix. I think I mentioned China yesterday a bit, but once we're in it with Russia, things are going to go downhill between the U.S. and China very, very fast. So Biden does have the potential, in one term, to be the most destructive president in American history. If we continue down this path, that's where we're going. And he has shown no signs of diverting. It seems that the incentives in their mind all go in the direction of ramping up tensions. Things keep getting more aggressive. Things keep getting worse. And so until I see any sign that they would change their stance, we're on World War III watch. No other way to put it. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.